The dust of Silver Creek was a fine, silver-gray powder that never settled. It rose from the hooves of tired horses, from the wheels of freight wagons, and from the boots of men who carried the weight of the mountains in their stride. It coated every storefront, settled in the bottom of every empty glass, and worked its way into the lungs of every soul who called the place home. The town itself was little more than a single, rutted street carved into the vast, unforgiving landscape of the Montana Territory. It was a place built on the shaky promise of ore and the solid reality of desperation. Here, in the year of our Lord 1878, justice was a cold weight in a man's hand, and kindness was a currency too dear for most to spend. May Harper knew the taste of that dust well. It was the taste of her life for the past 2 years, ever since her husband, Daniel, had taken his last breath in a tunnel collapse a half-mile underground. She walked with her head lowered, her gaze fixed on the splintered boardwalk beneath her feet. It was a habit born not of shyness, but of necessity. To meet the eyes of the men who loitered outside the saloon was to invite a comment. To meet the eyes of the women who swept their porches was to receive a look that was equal parts pity and judgment. She was the Widow Harper, a fixture of the town's muted scenery, a woman alone and therefore a problem to be watched. Her shoulders were perpetually hunched, as if bracing against a wind that only she could feel. It was the wind of memory, of Daniel's heavy moods and heavier hands. A gale she had thought she escaped when the mountain claimed him. But ghosts, she had learned, did not need air to breathe. They lived in the whispers that followed her down the street, in the sudden silence that fell when she entered the general store. The whispers said she was unlucky. They said Daniel had been a hard man. But what man was not? They wondered how a woman like her survived. The questions hung in the dusty air, unanswered because no one truly wanted to know. Her destination was the saloon, the very heart of the town's noise and loneliness. Her job was to erase the evidence of the previous night's revelry. She knelt on the rough floorboards, the smell of stale beer and sweat rising to meet her. With a stiff brush and a bucket of murky water, she scrubbed. It was mindless work, a penance of sorts. Each swish of the brush was a moment she did not have to think. She focused on the grime, the stubborn stains, the geography of 100 spilled drinks and 1,000 stomping boots. Here, on her knees, she was invisible, a part of the morning ritual no one noticed. It was a small, fragile piece. A pair of polished boots stopped just beside her bucket. She did not have to look up to know they belonged to Mr. Silas Croft, the owner. He was a man whose starched collars were as stiff as his spine. Mr. Croft cleared his throat. "May," he said, his voice smooth and without warmth. She paused, her hand frozen over the bucket. "Yes, Mr. Croft." He waited for her to look at him. She did so slowly, her eyes rising from his boots to his tailored trousers, to the gold watch chain draped across his vest. His face was clean-shaven, his expression unreadable. "Your services will no longer be required," he stated. It was not an apology or a negotiation. It was a fact, like the sunrise. May felt the air leave her lungs. She did not understand. She looked down at the floor she had just scrubbed, the wood gleaming wetly. "I have always done my work," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My wife's niece has come to town," he explained, his gaze drifting over her head toward the street. "She is in need of a position. It is a family matter. A family matter." The words were a neat, tidy wall she could not see past. She knew about his wife's niece, a pretty girl of 17 with ribbons in her hair and a laugh that carried. May had seen the way Mr. Croft and other men in town watched the girl. She understood. She was 28, but grief and hardship had carved years onto her face. She was a plain, quiet woman. She was not a girl with ribbons in her hair. She pushed herself to her feet, her knees aching. Her hands, red and raw from the harsh soap, trembled slightly. She wiped them on her apron. "Very well, Mr. Croft," she said. The words tasted like ash. There was nothing else to say. He had already turned away, his mind on other, more important things. She collected her bucket and brush and walked out of the saloon for the last time. The morning sun was bright, and it made her eyes water. The whispers of the town seemed to follow her, louder now, more insistent. The widow Harper, cast out again. What will she do now? She walked back to the Gable boarding house, a tall, cheerless building that was the closest thing she had to a home. Martha Gable stood on the porch, a thick-armed woman with a face that looked as if it had been carved from oak. She watched May approach, her eyes missing nothing. "He let you go," Martha said. It was not a question. News in Silver Creek traveled faster than a telegram. May could only nod, the lump in her throat too large to speak around. She felt a familiar hollowness spread through her chest, the fear of being utterly adrift. Her rent was due at the end of the week. She had less than $2 to her name. Martha grunted, a sound of grim acknowledgement. "Get inside," she ordered. "No sense in giving the gossips a free show." May's room was small, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto a dusty alley. She sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, her hands clasped in her lap. The quiet of the room was a heavy blanket. Out there, in the town, she was an object of speculation. In here, she was just May, a woman with nowhere to go. The silence she had once craved now felt like a cage. She wanted peace, a place where the past could not reach her, but the thought of complete solitude, of a silence that stretched on forever, terrified her. The door creaked open and Martha entered. Carrying a chipped enamel cup, she thrust it toward May. "Drink this," she said. "It is just tea." May took it, her fingers wrapping around its warmth. "Thank you," she murmured. Martha did not leave. She stood in the middle of the small room, her presence filling it entirely. "I might have something for you," she announced, her voice blunt. "It is not here. It is not a town job." May looked up, a flicker of hope so small it was painful. "What is it?" "A man needs a housekeeper, a rancher. Lives up north in the high country. Name of Reed Dawson." The name was unfamiliar. A rancher. The image that came to mind was of wide open spaces, of a sky bigger than any she had ever seen. "How far north?" she asked. "A day's ride," Martha answered. "Maybe a little more. It is isolated. You would see no one for weeks. Likely just him." Just him. The words sent a chill down May's spine. A man she did not know, alone, in a place far from anyone who could hear her scream. The ghost of Daniel rose in her mind, his face flushed with whiskey, his eyes dark with a rage she never understood. She had sworn she would never again place her life in the hands of one man. Martha saw the fear in her eyes and her expression softened. "Just a fraction." "He is a veteran," she said. "Fought for the South. Keeps to himself. Folks around here call him the Black Crow. Not because he is mean, they say. Just quiet. He trades his furs and buys his supplies once or twice a year. Pays in cash. That is all anyone knows." The Black Crow. The name suited the image of a man living alone in the wild, harsh country to the north. A man who preferred the company of silence. "He needs someone to cook and clean," Martha continued, her tone practical. "The work is honest. The pay is $10 a month, plus your room and board. It is more than you made scrubbing Croft's floor. Ben Harris is taking a supply wagon up that way the day after tomorrow. You could ride with him. $10 a month. It was a small fortune. Enough to live, enough to save, enough to perhaps one day find a place of her own. A place where no one knew the name Harper, but the price was to trade the prison of this town for the prison of a stranger's house. "I do not know," May said, her voice shaking. "To be so alone, with a man—" Martha sighed, a gust of impatient air. "Listen to me. May, what life do you have here? You will run out of money in a week. Then what? You think one of these fine church ladies will take you in? You think Silas Croft will give you your job back? There are only so many kinds of work for a woman alone in a town like this, and you are not suited for the other kind. Out there, with Dawson, it is just work. You cook his meals, you clean his house. He leaves you be. Is that not the quiet you are always seeking? Martha's words were hard, but they were true. Silver Creek had nothing left for her but scorn and starvation. She looked around the small, gray room. This was not a life. It was a waiting room. She was waiting for her meager savings to run out, for her spirit to finally break. "What if he is a hard man?" May asked, the words sticking in her throat. "Then you are no stranger to that, are you?" Martha replied, her voice low. "But this time, you can walk away. There are no neighbors to whisper. There is just the land. You saddle a horse and you ride. It is a cleaner kind of trouble, if it comes to that." A cleaner kind of trouble. The phrase echoed in May's mind. Here, the trouble was a slow poison, the daily dose of shame and pity. Out there, whatever dangers existed, they would be straightforward. A mountain lion did not judge you before it attacked. A blizzard did not gossip. She looked at Martha, at the woman's unyielding, practical face. Martha was not offering comfort. She was offering a door. It was up to May to walk through it. She thought of the endless, silent mountains she had seen from the edge of town, the way they stood against the sky, indifferent and immense. Perhaps there was a kind of peace in that indifference, a place where you were too small for anyone to bother judging. "I will take the job," she said. The decision, once made, settled in her with a surprising calm. Martha gave a single, sharp nod. "Good. Be ready when Ben comes. He will not wait." 2 days later, May stood beside a large, canvas-covered wagon. The morning was cold, the air thin and sharp. Ben Harris, the driver, was a man who seemed to be made of leather and gristle. He loaded her small, cloth-wrapped bundle into the back without a word. It contained her only spare dress, a brush, and a small, worn Bible that had belonged to her mother. It was the sum total of her worldly possessions. Martha was there to see her off. She pressed a small, heavy pouch into May's hand. "It is your last week's wages," she said gruffly. "I took out what you owed for the room. The rest is yours." May looked down. There were $4 inside, more than she had expected. "Thank you, Martha, for everything." Martha just grunted. "You are a good worker. May, do not let that man run you off. Remember what I said? The land is big. There is always a place to run to." May climbed onto the hard wooden seat of the wagon. Ben Harris clicked the reins, and the horses strained, pulling the heavy wagon into motion. The wheels groaned as they found the ruts in the street. May looked straight ahead, at the broad backs of the horses, at the long, empty road that stretched north. She could feel the eyes of the town on her back. She could hear their imagined whispers. "There goes the widow Harper, off to live with the Black Crow, gone to meet her fate." She kept her chin up, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She did not look at the saloon as they passed. She did not look at the general store or the church with its stark white steeple. She did not look at the gable boarding house. She was leaving it all behind. The dust, the whispers, the ghost of Daniel, the crushing weight of a life that was not her own. As the last buildings of Silver Creek fell away, replaced by scrub and rock and the rising slopes of the mountains, a wind picked up. It was a clean, cold wind that smelled of pine and distance. It whipped a loose strand of her hair across her face, and for the first time in a very long time, May Harper felt that she could breathe. She did not look back. The road north was not a road at all, but a suggestion. It was a pair of ruts that wound through sagebrush and rock, climbing steadily into a world that grew quieter with every turn of the wagon wheels. The chattering gossip of Silver Creek faded behind them, replaced by the creak of wood and leather, the steady plod of the horses, and a wind that spoke a language older than any town. Ben Harris did not talk. He chewed on a piece of dried grass and kept his eyes on the horizon, his silence as vast and impenetrable as the landscape itself. At first, the quiet was a relief to May. It was a clean slate, a page on which nothing had yet been written, but as the day wore on, the silence began to take on a new character. It was not empty. It was full. It was filled with the immense, breathing presence of the mountains that rose up on all sides, their peaks scraping against a sky of the deepest, most unforgiving blue. Forests of pine and fir carpeted their slopes, dark green oceans that seemed to sway in the wind. The scale of it all made her feel small, a tiny, insignificant thing crawling across the skin of the earth. In town, her loneliness had been a sharp, specific pain, defined by the people she was not with. Here, it was a profound, elemental state of being, as natural as the granite cliffs and the circling hawks high above. She was a solitary soul in a solitary land, and she could not tell if the feeling was one of freedom or of utter desolation. They stopped only once, at midday, to water the horses and eat a meal of hard bread and dried meat. Ben Harris offered her a piece without a word, and she accepted it with a quiet thank you. They ate with their backs to each other, looking out at different, empty vistas. She watched a golden eagle ride an updraft, its wings spread wide, and felt a pang of something she could not name. It was not envy, not exactly. It was a recognition of a wildness and a sovereignty she had never known. That bird belonged to this place. It was not a visitor, not a hired hand. It was home. As the sun began to dip toward the western peaks, casting long, distorted shadows across the valleys, the air grew colder. The wagon climbed higher, the trail narrowing. This was a land that did not welcome visitors. It tolerated them, for a time. Ben Harris pointed with his chin toward a dark line of trees ahead. "We are almost there," he said, his first full sentence of the day. The Bar J Ranch was not nestled in a valley. It clung to the side of a mountain, a raw clearing carved from the forest. It consisted of a long, low cabin built of dark, weathered logs, a sturdy-looking barn, and a series of corrals made from rough-hewn timber. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney. The only sign of life, the place looked as if it had grown from the ground itself, rugged and enduring. It was a testament to one man's stubborn refusal to be driven away. As the wagon rattled to a stop in the yard, the cabin door opened. A man stepped out and stood on the porch, watching them. He did not move forward to greet them. He simply stood, a tall, lean silhouette against the darkening interior of the house. May felt her breath catch in her chest. This must be him, Reed Dawson, the Black Crow. He was dressed in worn buckskin trousers and a plain, dark wool shirt. He was not a large man, but he held himself with a rigid stillness that made him seem formidable. His hair was black and long enough to touch his collar. His face was all sharp angles, his jaw set, his expression unreadable from this distance. He did not seem surprised or pleased or annoyed to see them. He simply observed, his patience that of a predator. Ben Harris climbed down from the wagon, his movement slow and deliberate. "Supplies. Dawson," he called out, his voice flat. "And the woman." Reed Dawson's gaze shifted from Ben to May. She felt it like a physical touch, a cold assessment that took in her worn dress, her tired posture, her clasped hands. His eyes, even from 20 paces, seemed dark and piercing. There was no welcome in them. There was not even curiosity. It was the look a man might give a horse he was considering buying, checking its teeth and its legs for flaws. He walked down the 3 steps of the porch. He moved with a slight, almost imperceptible limp, favoring his right leg. He did not hurry. He stopped a few feet from her side of the wagon and looked up. His face was weathered, browned by sun and wind, and etched with fine lines around his eyes, a long, thin scar, pale against his tanned skin. ran from the corner of his left eye down to his jawline. It was an old wound, but it gave his face a permanent severity. "You are the woman from Gables," he said. His voice was a low baritone, rough around the edges, like stones grinding together. It was the voice of a man who did not use it often. "Yes, sir," May managed to say, her own voice sounding thin and reedy. He nodded once, a short, sharp motion. "The kitchen is through that door. Your room is a small one next to it. Ben will bring your bundle." That was all. No greeting, no questions about her journey, no offer of a hand to help her down. He turned and walked back toward the cabin, his limp more noticeable now. He did not look back to see if she was following. He had given his orders. He expected them to be obeyed. May sat frozen for a moment, the cold finality of his words settling over her. Ben Harris had already begun unhitching the horses. His work here was nearly done. Soon he would be gone, and she would be left here, in this wild, lonely place, with that silent, scarred man. The fear she had been holding at bay for the entire journey rushed back in, cold and sharp. What had she done? She slid down from the wagon seat, her legs unsteady beneath her. She clutched her worn shawl around her shoulders and made her way toward the cabin, a small, solitary figure in the vast, encroaching twilight. The air smelled of pine and cold earth and wood smoke. The inside of the cabin was one large room, dim and filled with shadows. A long table and 2 benches stood in the center. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall. To her right was an open doorway that led, she presumed, to the kitchen. The air inside was cold, colder than it was outside, with a stillness that suggested the house had been empty for a long time. The floor was swept clean, and there were no signs of clutter, but it was not a home. It was a shelter. There were no pictures on the walls, no rugs on the floor, no cushions on the benches. It was a place stripped down to its barest essentials, a roof, walls, a place to burn a fire. It was the home of a man who expected no comfort from the world and offered none in return. She found the kitchen, a smaller space with a cast-iron stove, a dry sink with a hand pump, and shelves holding a few tin plates, cups, and basic provisions, sacks of flour and beans, a side of bacon hanging from a hook, jars of what looked like preserved fruit. Through another door was her room. It was little more than a closet, containing a narrow cot with a thin mattress and a single wool blanket. A small, high window looked out onto the dense, dark wall of the forest. This was to be her world. She heard the heavy thud of her bundle being dropped just inside the main door. Ben Harris called out, "I am leaving. Dawson." From somewhere outside, Reed's voice answered. A single, clipped word. "Fine." The front door closed with a solid, final sound. May heard the jingle of harnesses, the creak of wagon wheels, and then silence. A profound, ringing silence that pressed in on her from all sides. She was truly alone now. Alone with him. She stood in the middle of the cold kitchen, her arms wrapped around herself. The last of the daylight was fading from the small window. Panic, cold and sharp, rose in her throat. She could run. She could leave right now. Try to follow the wagon tracks back down the mountain. But to where? Back to Silver Creek. Back to the whispers and the pity and the slow starvation of the spirit. Martha's words came back to her. A cleaner kind of trouble. She took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. She was here to work. That was her purpose. Work was something she understood. Work was a shield. She looked at the cold, black stove. A house needed a fire. A man needed to eat. These were simple, undeniable facts. With a resolve that came from some deep, hidden well of strength she did not know she possessed, she moved. She found the wood box beside the stove. It was full of split, dry pine. She laid a fire carefully, the way her mother had taught her, with kindling at the bottom and larger pieces on top. She found a tin of matches on a high shelf. Her hand trembled as she struck one. The small flame sputtered. then caught a tiny point of light and warmth in the deep gloom. She held it to the kindling. The wood caught slowly, reluctantly at first, then with a sudden, cheerful crackle. Flames licked up, casting a warm, flickering glow across the kitchen. The light pushed back the shadows, making the small space seem less like a tomb and more like a room. For the first time since she had arrived, May felt a small measure of control. This she could do. She looked at the side of bacon hanging from its hook. She took a knife from a wooden block on the counter and sliced off several thick pieces. She found a heavy iron skillet and placed it on the stove. As the metal heated, she laid the bacon in the pan. The sound, when it came, was shockingly loud in the silent house. A sharp, aggressive sizzle. The smell of frying bacon, rich and savory, began to fill the cold air. The sound grew. A steady, energetic hiss and pop. It was the sound of life, of sustenance, of a home, however temporary. It was the first warm, domestic sound that had echoed within these walls in what felt like a very long time. It was a beginning. Standing in the firelight, skillet in hand, May Harper listened to the sound of the fat rendering in the pan, and for a moment, she was not afraid. She was simply a woman, cooking a meal in a house that was waiting to be woken up. The days at the Bar J Ranch fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons, a rhythm measured not in conversation, but in labor. Their life was a silent contract, its terms unspoken, but perfectly understood. May rose before dawn, the chill of the mountain air sharp on her cheeks. She would light the fire in the kitchen stove, the first small act of defiance against the cold and the dark. The smell of coffee brewing would soon fill the cabin, followed by the sizzle of bacon or the scent of baking biscuits. Reed Dawson would already be gone by then, having risen in the dark to tend to his horses and the few head of cattle that were his livelihood. He moved like a ghost in the pre-dawn gloom, his presence marked only by the distant, rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood, or the soft nicker of a horse. He would appear at the main door precisely as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He would sit at the long table, and she would place a plate of food before him. He ate quickly, efficiently, without any sign of pleasure or displeasure. His eyes were always distant, looking at something beyond the cabin walls. When he was finished, he would rise, give a single, almost imperceptible nod in her direction, not of thanks, but of acknowledgement, and walk back out into the vast, lonely world of his ranch. He would not return until dusk. Her days were spent in the company of the house. She scrubbed the floors, washed their few dishes, mended his torn shirts with neat, careful stitches, and tended a small vegetable garden she had started near the cabin. She learned the house's language, the creak of a specific floorboard, the way the wind moaned in the stone chimney, the slant of the afternoon sun through the single window in the main room. And through the house, she began to understand the man. It was a place scrubbed clean of the past. There were no photographs, no trinkets, no books other than a worn almanac. The furniture was handmade, sturdy and functional, with no care given to comfort or beauty. The walls were bare logs, the spaces between them chinked with mud and moss. It was not a home that held memories. It was a fortress designed to keep them out. She came to realize that Reed Dawson did not live in solitude. He was imprisoned by it. His silence was not a choice, but a condition. The deep, abiding quiet of a man who had lost the words for his own pain. This quiet was different from the one she had known with her husband. Daniel's silences had been heavy, menacing things, the calm before a storm of temper. They were filled with unspoken accusations and threats. Reed's silence was hollow. It was the sound of absence, of a part of him that had gone away to war and never returned. Some nights, after he had eaten his supper and she had cleared the plates, he would sit by the fire, not moving, for hours. He would stare into the flames, his hands resting on his knees, and his face would take on a look of such profound desolation that she would have to turn away, feeling as though she were intruding on a private grief. In those moments, the cabin felt less like a house and more like a tomb he was tending. The summer deepened, the days growing long and hot. The sun beat down on the high country, turning the wild grasses to a pale gold. The air grew thick and heavy, and afternoon skies began to build with dark, bruised-looking clouds. One afternoon, the storm that had been threatening for days finally broke. It began with a low, distant rumble that seemed to shake the very bones of the mountains. The sky turned a sickly shade of green-gray. The wind, which had been still all day, began to whip through the pines, their branches tossing and groaning. May brought the chickens into their small coop and secured the latch, her eyes on the horizon. Reed was somewhere out on the range, checking on a section of fence that had been damaged by a rock slide. Then the rain came. It was not a gentle summer shower, but a violent, vertical assault. It fell in solid, wind-driven sheets, blurring the entire world into a churning chaos of gray. The sound on the cabin's sod roof was a deafening roar. Lightning split the sky, followed instantly by cracks of thunder that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the tin plates on the kitchen shelves. May stood at the window, her hand pressed against the cool glass, and watched the storm's fury. She was not afraid for herself. The cabin was solid, built to withstand such things, but a cold knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach for the man out in the middle of it. He was a capable man. She knew, but the elements were a force that humbled even the strongest. An hour passed, then another. The heart of the storm moved on, but the rain continued. A steady, drenching downpour. The world outside was awash, small rivers of muddy water carving new paths through the yard. As dusk began to settle, she saw him. He was walking, not riding, leading his horse, which was limping badly. He moved slowly, his head bowed against the rain, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. She opened the door as he reached the porch. He did not seem to notice her at first. He was soaked through, his dark hair plastered to his skull, water streaming from the brim of his hat. He led the horse toward the barn without a word, his movements stiff. When he finally came back and stepped into the cabin, he brought the cold and the wet with him. He dripped onto the floorboards, leaving a growing puddle at his feet. There was a long, bleeding gash on his forearm, red and angry against his cold, pale skin. A falling branch, most likely. He stripped off his sodden hat and jacket, dropping them onto a peg by the door. He ignored the cut on his arm as if it did not exist. He walked to the fireplace and stood before it, his back to her, shivering slightly. He did not ask for a towel or for dry clothes. He did not speak of the storm or his horse. He stood in his wet shirt and trousers, a man encased in a misery so private that it allowed for no witness. May looked at him, at the rigid line of his back, the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. She saw not the silent, intimidating rancher, but a man bone-weary and hurt, trying to hold himself together. An impulse, simple and unthinking, moved her. It was not pity. It was a flash of plain, human recognition. She turned and went into the kitchen. There were 2 chickens in the coop. One of them would not see the morning. She found the root cellar trap door and descended into the cool, earthy darkness, retrieving a few onions and carrots. Working quickly, with a focused efficiency, she prepared the bird. She put a large pot of water on the stove, which was still warm. She chopped the vegetables, the rhythmic tap of the knife on the cutting board, a small, purposeful sound in the quiet house. Soon, the rich, savory aroma of simmering chicken and vegetables began to push back against the damp chill in the air. It was a smell of comfort, of warmth, of care. It was the smell of a home. She ladled the steaming, fragrant broth into a thick pottery bowl. She added chunks of tender chicken and soft carrots. She found a loaf of bread she had baked that morning and cut a thick slice. carrying the bowl and the bread on a small wooden tray. She walked back into the main room. Reed had not moved. He was still standing before the fire, which she had built up while the soup was cooking. The flames now leaped and danced, casting a warm, orange glow that made the shadows retreat to the corners of the room. She did not say his name. She simply walked to the table and set the tray down with a soft click. The sound was small, but in the immense quiet, it was as loud as a shout. He turned his head slowly. He looked at the bowl of soup, steam rising from it in a fragrant cloud. He looked at the slice of bread. Then his eyes lifted and met hers. For the first time, she saw something in them other than distance. It was a flicker of surprise, of confusion. His gaze was intense, searching, as if he were trying to understand the reason for this unexpected offering. She did not hold his gaze. She gave a small nod toward the bowl, and then retreated to the shadows of the kitchen doorway, giving him his space. She watched, her heart beating a little too fast. She expected him to ignore it, to let it grow cold on the table as a quiet rebuke for her presumption. For a long moment, he did nothing. He just stood there, caught between the fire and the table. Then, with a slow, weary movement, he walked to the bench and sat down. He picked up the spoon. He hesitated for a second, then dipped it into the bowl and brought it to his lips. He ate. He did not eat quickly, as he usually did, but slowly, deliberately, as if tasting it, as if remembering something long forgotten. May watched his shoulders. With every spoonful, the rigid, unyielding line of them seemed to soften. The tension that he carried like a second skin began to melt away, undone by the simple warmth of the soup. He broke the bread and soaked up the last of the broth, his movements methodical. He did not make a sound. When the bowl was empty, he placed the spoon inside it and pushed it gently away. He did not look at her. He did not say thank you, but he did not need to. She had seen it in the way his hands had finally unclenched. In the long, slow breath he let out as he leaned his elbows on the table. The small, unsolicited act of kindness had breached a wall that day. It was not a grand gesture, not a declaration. It was just a bowl of soup on a stormy night. But in the cold, silent house of the Black Crow, it was everything. The air, for the very first time, was filled with the lingering scent of warmth. The bowl of soup did not magically unbar the doors of Reed Dawson's soul, but it did leave one slightly ajar. In the days that followed, the silence in the cabin remained, but its texture changed. It was no longer a hollow, ringing void, but a quieter, more watchful space. He still left before dawn and returned at dusk. He still ate without comment. But now, when he sat by the fire, he would sometimes glance toward the kitchen doorway where she was cleaning up, his expression unreadable, before turning his gaze back to the flames. It was a small thing, but it was different. May, for her part, focused on her work, grateful for the fragile, unspoken truce. She did not press the opening he had allowed. She simply continued to cook his meals, to keep the house in order, and to tend her small garden. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the weariness in his walk, as a measure of his day. She noticed that he never touched the gash on his forearm. He treated it with the same stoic indifference with which he treated everything else, as if acknowledging the pain would give it a power he refused to concede. She saw the trouble a full day before it declared itself. The skin around the cut, which had been a clean line of red, began to darken at the edges, turning a bruised purple. A faint pink flush was spreading up his arm. That evening, he barely touched his supper. He moved stiffly, his face drawn and tight with a pain he would not name. He went to his bed, a simple bunk built into the far wall of the main room soon after, skipping his usual vigil by the fire. The next morning, he did not rise in the dark. May lit the kitchen stove and put the coffee on to brew, her ears straining for the familiar sounds of him stirring, of the cabin door opening and closing, There was only silence, a deep, unnatural silence that sent a prickle of fear along her arms. Finally, her anxiety overriding her reluctance to intrude, she stepped out of the kitchen. She walked softly to the side of his bunk. He was lying on his back, his breathing shallow and rapid. A sheen of sweat covered his face. Though the morning air was cold, one arm was thrown across his forehead. The other, the injured one, lay beside him on the blanket, swollen to nearly twice its normal size. The dark infection had spread, angry red streaks now reaching for his shoulder. He was burning with fever. She laid a hand on his forehead, and the heat that radiated from his skin was shocking. He flinched at her touch but did not wake. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he was gravely ill. Out here, miles from any town, miles from any doctor. A fever like this was a death sentence. There was no one to help. There was only her. A wave of panic washed over her, so strong it made her dizzy. She was a housekeeper, not a nurse. What did she know of healing a man this sick? Her first instinct was to run, to saddle a horse and flee this house of sickness and silence. But where would she go, and what would become of him? To leave him here to die alone was a cruelty she could not stomach. He was her employer, a stranger, a difficult and silent man. But he was also a human being, helpless and in her care. She took a deep, steadying breath and pushed the panic down. She would do what she could. She had seen her mother tend to fevers before. The first step was to bring the heat down. She went to the pump and filled a basin with cold, clear water from the well. She found a clean rag. Returning to his bedside, she gently wiped his face and neck. He groaned, a low, guttural sound, and shifted restlessly. His shirt was soaked with sweat and needed to come off, and the wound, she knew, had to be cleaned, lanced if she could find the courage. Her hands hesitated for a moment over the front of his wool shirt. This was a line she had never imagined crossing. To touch him, to undress him, felt like a profound violation of the unspoken rules that governed their lives. She thought of Daniel, of the times she had been forced into closeness, and her fingers recoiled. But Reed's labored breathing was a harsh reminder of the necessity. This was not about a man and a woman. This was about a life hanging in the balance. Her fingers, clumsy with a mixture of fear and resolve, found the first button. It was a small, polished disc of bone. She worked it free from its hole. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open for a moment. They were glazed with fever, unfocused. He seemed to look right through her. She moved to the next button, her touch as light as she could make it. As her fingers brushed the skin of his chest, he groaned again, a sound of deep, wrenching agony that had nothing to do with his arm. His voice, when he spoke, was a ragged, broken whisper, thick with delirium. She undid his buttons. He groaned. "Darlin, you'll drive me past redemption." The word struck her like a physical blow. She froze, her hand hovering over his chest. Darlin. The endearment was so shocking, so out of place, that she could not process it. And the rest, redemption. It was the plea of a damned soul, not the fevered rambling of a sick man. She looked at his face. His eyes were closed again, his brow furrowed in torment. He was not speaking to her. She realized he was speaking to a ghost, a memory dredged up from the depths of the fever. It was a moment of terrifying, unintended intimacy. She was seeing past the silent rancher, past the scarred veteran, and into the raw, unguarded heart of his suffering. Her fear was replaced by a surge of empathy so strong it ached in her chest. He was not a threat. He was a broken man, fighting a war within himself that was far older than this fever, with renewed purpose. She quickly finished unbuttoning his shirt. She eased it off his shoulders, her movements careful. With the shirt gone, she saw them, the scars. His chest and shoulders were a roadmap of old violence. A puckered, star-shaped scar high on his left shoulder told of a bullet that had gone clean through. Another. A long, ragged line that ran across his ribs looked to have been laid open by a blade. There were smaller, fainter marks, a constellation of past pains. They were the silent testament to the life he had lived, the reason for the walls he had built around himself. She looked at them, and for the first time, she felt she was truly seeing the man, not just the silhouette he presented to the world. She turned her attention to the infected arm. It was hot to the touch, the skin stretched tight and shiny. She knew what she had to do. Taking the sharpest knife from the kitchen, she held the blade in the fire until it glowed red, then plunged it into the whiskey Reed kept on a high shelf. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was firm. She knelt beside him, took a deep breath, and made a swift, clean cut across the most swollen part of the wound. He cried out, a sharp, ragged sound, and his whole body arched in pain. A foul-smelling mixture of blood and pus erupted from the incision. May's stomach churned, but she did not falter. She pressed gently, cleaning the wound as best she could, her touch now firm and sure. She washed it with the whiskey, which made him cry out again, and then bandaged it tightly with strips torn from a clean flour sack. For the next 2 days and nights, she did not leave his side. The fever raged, holding him in its grip. He thrashed and turned, lost in a world of violent memories. He spoke in broken fragments, his voice raw with anguish. And one name he called out again and again. Samuel. "Samuel, get down!" he shouted into the empty cabin, his voice cracking with desperation. "The orchard! God, the smell of peaches! I told you to get down. Sam, it's my fault." She sat in a wooden chair pulled up to his bunk, wiping his face with cool cloths, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips. She listened to the story he had never intended to tell, piecing it together from the fevered shards. Shiloh, a peach orchard in full bloom, a younger brother named Samuel, who had not gotten down. She listened to his guilt, a raw, open wound that had never healed, far deeper than the one on his arm. She felt like a priest in a confessional, hearing the sins of a man who believed himself beyond forgiveness. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fever broke. He fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, his breathing evening out for the first time since the sickness had taken hold. May, utterly exhausted, finally allowed her own eyes to close, her head slumping against the hard back of the chair. She woke to the feeling of being watched. She opened her eyes, and he was looking at her. His own eyes were clear, the fever gone. They were filled with a weary, devastating lucidity. He knew that she had seen him, that she had heard him. There was no hiding place left for him. "How long?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. 3 days, she answered softly. He closed his eyes for a moment, a flicker of something shame, perhaps crossing his face. He tried to push himself up and winced, his gaze falling on the clean bandage on his arm. He looked back at her. "I suppose I should thank you." "There is no need," she said. They were silent for a long time. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. "What did I say?" he finally asked, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. May hesitated. To tell him was to acknowledge the ghost that stood between them. To lie was to rebuild the wall she had just spent 3 days dismantling. She chose the truth. "You spoke of Samuel," she said gently. His jaw tightened. She saw him swallow hard. He did not speak for another minute, and she thought that was the end of it, that the door was closing once more. But then he began to talk, his voice quiet and heavy, as if he were pulling each word up from a great depth. "He was my younger brother," he said, still not looking at her. "Just 17. I was the one who told him it would be an adventure. I was the one who told him to sign up with me. I was supposed to look after him." He paused, and his breath hitched. "We were at Shiloh, in a peach orchard. The blossoms were all out. It was the prettiest place I had ever seen. And then it was hell. I told him to stay down, but he was young and full of fire. He thought he was invincible. I saw him fall." His voice broke on the last word. He finally turned his head on the pillow and looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a pain so vast it seemed to have no end. "I left him there, under the peach blossoms. I have been leaving him there every day for 16 years. May felt her own throat tighten, not with pity, but with a profound, aching recognition. She saw his guilt, his belief that he was unworthy of forgiveness, and in it, she saw a reflection of her own shadowed heart. His confession gave her the courage to offer her own. "My husband," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "His name was Daniel. He was a hard man. He had a temper that was like a storm, and I was the only ground for the lightning to strike." She looked down at her hands, at the faint, old scars on her knuckles. "When I heard he was gone, that the mountain had taken him, the first thing I felt was not grief. It was relief, a terrible, selfish gladness that it was over. And I have felt like a sinner for that feeling every day since, to be glad that a man is dead." She looked up and met his gaze. The silence that fell between them now was different. It was not empty or cold. It was a space filled with the weight of their shared truths, their shared brokenness. He, the man who believed he had caused a death. She, the woman who had been glad for one. Two lost souls, adrift in the vast wilderness, who had stumbled upon each other in the dark. He did not offer her absolution, and she did not offer him comfort. They did not have those things to give. But in his eyes, she saw an understanding that went deeper than words. He saw her, not as the widow Harper, not as his housekeeper, but as a fellow traveler carrying a heavy burden. And she saw him, not as the fearsome black crow, but as a man haunted by a boy in a peach orchard. In that moment of shared confession, in that quiet, sunlit cabin, the healing began. It was not a cure, but the simple, profound recognition that they were not alone in their guilt. And for two people who had believed themselves to be past redemption, that was a start. It was a kind of grace. The fever receded like a tide, leaving Reed Dawson washed out and quiet, beached on the shores of a new reality. The walls he had so carefully constructed around himself had been breached, not by force, but by a fever's delirium and a woman's steady care. In the days of his recovery, a different kind of silence settled over the Barjay Ranch. It was no longer the silence of two strangers sharing a roof, but the quiet of two people who had seen the unvarnished truth of each other and had not turned away. The change in him was not in words. He remained a man of few syllables. The transformation was in his hands, in small, deliberate actions that spoke a language May was beginning to understand. A few days after he was back on his feet, she rose before dawn as always, heading for the kitchen pump to haul the day's first water. But when she got there, the heavy wooden bucket was already full, brimming with cold, clear water, dewdrops clinging to its sides. She stood for a long moment, staring at it. It was a simple chore, one she had done every day without thought. But for him to have done it for her, to have risen in the dark while still weak and thought of her, was a gesture of profound, unspoken gratitude. It was a silent apology for being a burden, and a thank you for saving him. She carried the bucket inside, the weight of the water feeling somehow lighter than it ever had before. A week later, she came into the kitchen to find a small pile of wild raspberries on the table, their deep red color like jewels against the plain, scrubbed wood. She knew the patch they must have come from, a thorny thicket a good mile's walk up the mountain. He must have gone there specifically, his long strides carrying him on an errand that had nothing to do with fences or cattle. An errand for her. She ate one, and its taste was a burst of summer sweetness, a flavor of pure, unasked for kindness. These small offerings became a part of their new rhythm, a hawk's feather, perfect and unruffled, left on the porch rail, a handful of smooth, river-washed stones placed on the windowsill, their colors muted and earthy. Each was a message, a quiet acknowledgement of her presence. of her place in this world he had once inhabited alone. She, in turn, accepted them in the same spirit. She did not thank him aloud, for she knew words would only make him retreat. Instead, she would put the feather in a small jar, or bake the berries into a sweet bread for their supper. Their communication became a gentle back and forth of deeds, a conversation held in the silent language of care. The house itself seemed to breathe more easily. The oppressive weight of his solitude had lifted, replaced by a shared quiet that was comfortable, even companionable. They moved around each other with an unconscious grace, anticipating each other's needs. He noticed a floorboard near the hearth had come loose, and, without being asked, he mended it, the sound of his hammer a brief, purposeful punctuation in the day's silence. She saw that his favorite shirt was frayed at the cuff and repaired it with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. They were no longer just a man and his housekeeper. They were partners in the simple, demanding enterprise of living. One afternoon, about a month after his sickness, he sat on the porch steps, working with a piece of seasoned birch wood and a small, sharp knife. May watched him from the kitchen window as she kneaded dough for the evening's bread. His hands, which she knew to be strong and capable of both violence and hard labor, moved with a surprising delicacy. He was not just whittling, he was creating. The wood shavings fell at his feet in fragrant curls as a shape began to emerge from the block. Later that day, when she went to stir the stew simmering on the stove, she found it resting on the counter beside the pot, a wooden spoon. It was smooth and perfectly balanced, the bowl deep, the handle fitting her hand as if it had been made just for her. She ran her thumb over the surface of the wood. It was still faintly warm from his hands. She saw the care in every curve, the patience in its flawless finish. He had made her a tool, a beautiful, humble thing for the work that had brought warmth and life back into his house. That night, as she served the stew, she used the new spoon, and the simple act felt like a sacrament. The spoon, the bowl of soup it had once served, the bright, warm light from the kitchen lamp. They were the symbols of the new life taking root here, a fragile bloom in the wilderness. The truest change, the one that settled deep in May's own soul, was a sense of peace. For the first time since she was a little girl, she felt safe. The constant, low-level fear that had been her companion for so many years had finally receded. She no longer startled at the sound of a footstep. She no longer braced herself for a harsh word or a sudden temper. Reed's quiet was a sanctuary, his presence a steady, protective bulwark. This feeling of peace unloosed something in her she had thought long dead. One sunny afternoon, while she was weeding her small vegetable garden, a sense of simple contentment washed over her. The sun was warm on her back, the earth was dark and rich beneath her fingers, and the air was filled with the scent of pine and growing things. A tune surfaced from the deep well of her memory, a simple folk song her mother used to sing while hanging laundry. Without thinking, she began to hum. The sound was soft at first, tentative in the vast quiet of the mountains. Then, feeling bolder, she let the words come, her voice a low, gentle murmur. It was a song about a river flowing to the sea, a simple melody of homecoming. She had not sung in years. Daniel had hated her singing, said it was a foolish noise, and after he was gone, there had been nothing to sing about. But now, the song felt as natural as breathing. She did not know he was there until she saw his shadow fall over the row of beans she was tending. She stopped abruptly, the last note catching in her throat, a flush of embarrassment rising to her cheeks. He was standing at the corner of the barn, a piece of harness in his hand, his work apparently forgotten. He had not been walking by, he had been standing there, listening. She waited for him to speak, to mock her foolishness or to order her to be quiet. He did nothing, he just looked at her, and his expression was one she had never seen before. It was not his usual guarded stoicism. It was a look of stillness, of deep, quiet contemplation. with a softness around his eyes that took her breath away. It was as if her small, simple song had reached a place in him no one had touched for a very long time. He held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, slow nod. It was not his usual curt acknowledgement. This was something else entirely. It was permission. It was acceptance. Then he turned and walked back into the barn, leaving her alone in the garden with the sun and the silence. She did not start singing again that day, but she knew that she could. They had become a family, an unnamed, unspoken family of two. They were bound by no laws, no vows, only by the shared geography of their scars and the quiet language of their healing. In the evenings, the cabin was no longer a cold shelter, but a warm, living space. A fire would burn brightly in the hearth. He would sit on one side, cleaning a rifle or mending a piece of leather, and she would sit on the other, patching a shirt or reading a chapter from her mother's Bible by the light of the lamp. They rarely spoke, but the silence was a comfortable blanket, woven through with a thread of mutual respect and a deep, burgeoning affection that neither of them yet had a name for. It was enough, for now, to simply share the light. The peace they had built was a fragile terrarium, a small, self-contained world that thrived on isolation. But the world outside was large and demanding, and eventually, it made its needs known. The flour sack grew limp, the coffee tin was nearly empty, and the salt was down to a fine, dusty powder at the bottom of its wooden box. There was no avoiding it. They had to go to town. Reed announced it one morning over breakfast, his voice as flat and factual as if he were commenting on the weather. "We are low on supplies. We will ride to Silver Creek tomorrow." May's hands, which had been steady as she poured his coffee, gave a slight tremor, sending a dark splash onto the table. Silver Creek. The name was a stone dropping into the calm pool of her new life. To go back there, to the place of whispers and pity, felt like a regression, a retreat into a past she had worked so hard to escape. But to go back there with him, that was something else entirely. It was to take their quiet, private world and expose it to the harsh, judging light of day. "Yes," was all she said, her voice tight. "Of course." He looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to register her disquiet. For a moment, she thought he might say something more, offer a word of reassurance, perhaps even suggest he go alone. But the moment passed. He simply gave one of his short, conclusive nods and turned his attention back to his plate. The matter was settled. The wagon ride the next morning was a study in contrasts. The silence between them was the same. A familiar, comfortable quiet they had shared for months. But beneath it, a current of tension ran, a low hum of anxiety that had not been there before. May sat straight-backed on the hard wooden seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the dusty road ahead. She felt as if she were escorting a secret, something precious and easily broken, into a place where it would surely be misunderstood. As the first ramshackle buildings of Silver Creek came into view, she felt the old habits return, her shoulders instinctively hunched, her head lowered, her eyes seeking the familiar safety of the ground. The dust in the air seemed thicker here, heavier with the weight of memory and judgment. Reed pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the general store. As he climbed down, his presence drew immediate attention. Men loitering on the boardwalk stopped their conversations. Women sweeping their porches paused, their brooms held still. The Black Crow had come down from his mountain, and he was not alone. May could feel their stares like a physical touch, 100 tiny needles pricking her skin. She saw the looks exchanged, the heads bent together, the whispers forming on their lips. "There is the widow Harper. Look at her," tamed him. Has she... The heat rose in her cheeks, a flush of shame and defiance. She was not a spectacle. The life she had built was real and good, and it was hers. She lifted her chin and met the gaze of a woman across the street, holding it until the woman looked away. Flustered. "I will get the provisions," Reed said, his voice low and for her ears only. Stay with the wagon. It was not a command born of mistrust, she knew, but of a desire to shield her. But it left her exposed, a solitary figure seated on the wagon, the sole object of the town's avid curiosity. She watched him disappear into the dim interior of the store, his tall frame filling the doorway for a moment before he was gone. She did not have to wait long. A man detached himself from a group lounging outside the saloon and sauntered toward her. He was thick-set and unshaven, and he walked with a swagger that was more bluster than confidence. She recognized him with a sinking heart. Jed Stone. He had been one of Daniel's drinking companions, a man whose eyes had always lingered on her a moment too long, his gaze filled with a greasy familiarity that made her skin crawl. Well, well, he said, stopping a few feet from the wagon and planting his hands on his hips. His breath carried the sour smell of stale whiskey. If it ain't the little widow Harper. Heard you run off to keep house for the crow. Looks like mountain living agrees with you. He grinned, revealing a row of stained teeth. May said nothing. She looked past him, her face a cool, impassive mask, praying for Reed to return. Her silence only seemed to egg him on. He took a step closer, resting one boot on the wagon wheel. Quiet as ever. I see, always the proper little church mouse. Must get lonely up there for Dawson. I bet you keep him warm on them cold mountain nights. Part of your duties. Is it? The crude insinuation struck her with the force of a slap. The men outside the saloon chuckled. A few women who had been passing by stopped to watch, their faces a mixture of shock and eager anticipation. This was the town she had left behind, a place where a woman's reputation was a toy for board, cruel men to break for their own amusement. You should leave me be, Jed, she said, her voice low and even, betraying none of the fury that was coiling in her stomach. Oh, I think not, he sneered. Danny was my friend. Breaks my heart to see his widow shacked up with some Reb hermit before he's even cold in the ground. You have no shame, no shame at all. He reached out then, his hand moving to grab her arm, before his fingers could touch her. Another hand, large and sinewy, closed around his wrist like a steel trap. Reed was there. He had come out of the store so silently that no one had noticed his approach. He stood beside the wagon, his body a rigid line of fury. He did not say a word. He simply stood there, holding Jed Stone's wrist, his dark eyes fixed on the other man's face. The grip must have been painful, because the color drained from Jed's face, his swagger vanishing in an instant, replaced by a raw, naked fear. The street went silent. The laughter from the saloon died. Everyone watched, holding their breath. Reed's silence was more terrifying than any shouted threat. It was absolute and cold and filled with a capacity for violence that was plain for all to see. Jed tried to pull his arm away, but it was like trying to break free from granite. I was just talking, Jed stammered, his eyes wide. No harm meant. Dawson! Reed's gaze did not waver. He slowly, deliberately, tightened his grip. A small gasp of pain escaped Jed's lips. Finally, Reed spoke, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the silence. You are done talking. He released Jed's wrist with a slight shove that sent the man stumbling backward. Jed cradled his hand, his face a mask of humiliation and fear. He shot a venomous glare at May, then turned and practically fled back to the safety of the saloon. The spell was broken. The crowd began to murmur. To move again, the show was over. Reed turned and began loading the sacks of flour and coffee into the back of the wagon, his movements economical and precise, as if nothing had happened. A man from the crowd, the blacksmith by the look of his leather apron, stepped forward. Good on you, Dawson, he said, a note of respect in his voice. That Stone is a disgrace, but folks will talk. Just who is she to you? May's heart stopped. She looked at Reed, her entire being focused on his answer. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them, This was the moment. The moment he would give a name to the unspoken thing they had built. The moment he would claim her. Not as property, but as a person who mattered to him. In front of the world that had cast her out. Reed finished placing a sack of beans in the wagon and straightened up. He did not look at May. He looked at the blacksmith, his expression as hard and unreadable as ever. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and cold, meant for all to hear. "She is the woman who works at the bar, Jay," he said, nothing more. The words were a physical blow, a shard of ice in her heart. Nothing more. All the quiet moments, the shared meals, the wooden spoon, his confession in the fevered darkness, her tireless care, all of it, in a single, public declaration, was reduced to a business transaction. $10 a month. He had not defended her honor. He had defined her status. He had put her back in her place. The place the town had always assigned her a paid servant, a person of no consequence. He had not seen a partner worth protecting, but a possession to be claimed, a hired hand who was being harassed. The warmth that had bloomed in her over the past months withered and died, leaving a cold, hollow ache in its place. The blood drained from her face. She felt the stares of the crowd again, but now they were different. They were filled with a new kind of pity. She was not the woman who had tamed the black crow. She was just his housekeeper, a poor widow he had seen fit to protect out of a sense of duty, not affection. Her humiliation was complete. He climbed back onto the wagon seat beside her. "We are leaving," he said. She could not speak. She could not even look at him. She stared straight ahead, seeing nothing, as he clicked the reins and the wagon began to move. The journey out of town was a torment. The silence that had once been their sanctuary was now a gaping chasm between them, filled with her pain and his ignorance of it. He had faced down a man for her, yet with a handful of words. He had wounded her more deeply than Jedstone ever could. They were a few miles out of town, the last of the scattered homesteads disappearing behind them, when she finally found her voice. "Stop the wagon," she said. The words were quiet, but they were hard, brittle things. He pulled the horses to a halt. He turned to look at her, a question in his eyes. She did not meet his gaze. She looked out at the vast, indifferent mountains. "I am not going back with you," she said. She slid down from the wagon seat before he could react. She stood in the dusty road, a small, solitary figure. She had nothing but the clothes on her back. He stared down at her, his face a mask of confusion. "What are you talking about? Where will you go?" "Back there," she said, gesturing with her head toward Silver Creek. "It is no worse than what you just told them all I am." Her voice broke on the last few words. A single, hot tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "I am not just the woman who works at your ranch. I thought I was more than that." She saw a flicker of understanding, of dawning horror. In his eyes, he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he say? He was a man who lived by facts, and he had stated one. He did not have the language for the truth that lay beneath it. He did not know how to tell her that in trying to protect her from the town's gossip. He had destroyed the very thing that made her feel safe. So he said nothing. He just sat there, holding the reins, his knuckles white, his silence, which she had once mistaken for strength, for peace, was just an emptiness after all, a place where words of love and reassurance and apology could not grow. She turned her back on him and on the wagon. She began to walk, her steps steady, back toward the town she despised, back to the dust and the whispers. It was a prison, but it was one she was entering with her eyes open, her pride, however wounded, still intact. She did not look back. She knew if she did, she would see him still sitting there, a lone figure in the vast landscape, watching her go, trapped inside a silence of his own making. The walk back to Silver Creek was the longest journey of May's life. Each step was a measured beat of humiliation, a confirmation of her own foolishness. The sun beat down, but she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold of a hope extinguished, a trust betrayed. She had allowed herself to believe in a shared silence, to think it was a garden where something tender could grow. Now she knew it was just a barren field, and she had been the only one planting seeds. She did not go to Martha Gable's front door. She went around to the back, like a servant, and knocked softly on the kitchen entrance. When Martha opened it, her face a mask of stern surprise, May could not bring herself to speak. She just stood there, the dust of the road clinging to her dress, her spirit worn down to a nub. Martha looked past her, at the empty road. "He left you?" It was a flat statement, devoid of pity. "I left him," May corrected, the words tasting like ash. Martha's eyes narrowed, taking in May's tear-streaked, dusty face. She saw the truth of it, the deep, ragged wound that had nothing to do with a simple parting of ways. She grunted, a sound of weary resignation. "Well, the world keeps turning, and the rent is still due on Fridays." She stepped aside, holding the door open. "There is a cot in the laundry room. It will have to do." And so May's life contracted, shrinking from the vast, open sky of the mountains to the 4 steamy, soap-scented walls of the boarding house laundry. Her world became a cycle of lye, hot water, and other people's dirt. She scrubbed the miners' filthy long johns, the saloon girls' cheap, frilly chemises, the church ladies' starched Sunday blouses. Her hands, which had softened from gardening and kneading bread, became red and raw again. The skin cracked and sore. The whispers she had fled returned, now edged with a smug, knowing cruelty. She would deliver a basket of neatly folded linens to a doorstep and catch the smirk on a woman's face, the pitying glance that said, "I knew it." She aimed too high and fell. The story of the confrontation with Jed Stone had become town legend, but it was always told with Reed's final, cutting words as the punchline. "She's the woman who works at the bar, Jay." Nothing more. The words followed her, a brand she could not wash away. She lived in a state of bitter, guarded pride. She spoke to no one unless necessary. She kept her eyes down, her face set in a hard, neutral mask. The warmth that had bloomed in her at the ranch was gone, replaced by a cold, protective shell. At night, alone on her narrow cot, the smell of bleach sharp in her nostrils, she would allow herself to feel the full, aching weight of her loss. She missed the quiet. She missed the hawk's feather and the wooden spoon. She missed the man who had stared into the fire, his soul laid bare, and the man who had listened to her sing, his eyes soft with a forgotten gentleness. She missed a home she had not realized she had found until she had walked away from it. Then the anger would rise, hot and cleansing, and she would tell herself she was better off. Pride was a colder companion than love, but it was a more reliable one. The summer faded into a crisp, golden autumn. The aspen trees on the high slopes turned a brilliant yellow, a final, defiant blaze of color before the long white sleep of winter. May marked the passage of time by the changing weight of the laundry. The miners' woolens grew heavier. The women's dresses were made of thicker stuff. The wind that blew down from the north carried a new, sharper bite. It smelled of snow. She heard nothing from the mountains, no word, no message. It was as if the Bar J Ranch and the man who lived there had been a dream. She told herself it was for the best. She was building a life, of a sort. It was a hard, lonely life, but it was hers. She owed nothing to anyone. The first snow came in late October, a light dusting that melted by noon, but it was a promise. A week later, the sky turned to flat, heavy gray, and a wind began to howl, a mournful, keening sound that seemed to carry all the loneliness of the world in its voice. The snow began in the afternoon, small, hard pellets at first, then thick, wet flakes that clung to everything, blanketing the town in a sudden, suffocating silence. May was in the laundry, finishing the last of her work, when she heard a frantic pounding on the back door. It was not a polite knock. It was the sound of desperation, She opened it to find a young man, hardly more than a boy, his face raw with cold, a thick layer of snow caked on his shoulders and the brim of his hat. He had a half-frozen, terrified look in his eyes. He must have seen her through the window. "Are you the woman?" he gasped, his teeth chattering. "The one from Dawson's place." May's heart seized. "What is it? What has happened?" "I was trapping up north," the boy stammered, his words tumbling out. "Got caught in this. My horse went lame. I saw smoke from his chimney. Went for shelter. I found him. He's bad, ma'am, real bad." "Bad how?" she demanded, her voice sharp, grabbing the boy's arm to steady him. "He has cut up something fierce. Looks like a log rolled on him. Crushed his leg. And the fever, it's come back. The old wound on his arm. It's angry again. He is out of his head, burning up. I did what I could, but he needs help. He needs—" The boy trailed off, his gaze locking with hers. "He is calling for you, over and over. He just says your name." "May." The world seemed to fall away. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears, a frantic, roaring drumbeat. He was dying. Alone, in that silent cabin, in the middle of a blizzard. And he was calling for her, the man whose pride, whose inability to speak a simple truth, had sent her away, was calling for her in his final moments. Her first thought was a cold, hard no. The word had rose in her throat, bitter with the taste of her own wounded pride. Let him die. He had made his choice in the street in Silver Creek. He had defined her as nothing more than a servant. Why should she ride into the teeth of a blizzard for a man who had publicly shamed her? Why should his death be her concern? She owed him nothing. She looked at the boy's frightened face. She looked past him, into the swirling chaos of the storm. The snow coming down so thick it was like a solid white wall. To go out in that was madness. It was suicide. And for what? For a memory of kindness. For a man who could not bring himself to say she mattered. She thought of him in the bunk, his body ravaged by the first fever. She remembered the scars on his chest, the story of Samuel whispered in the dark. She remembered the way he looked when he listened to her sing. She saw the man, not the prideful fool who had wounded her, but the broken, lonely soul who had shared his deepest pain with her, the man who had, for a brief, warm season, made her feel safe. To let him die alone, calling her name into the uncaring storm. It was an abandonment she could not live with. It was a cruelty that would stain her own soul, leaving her as cold and empty as the cabin would be when his fire finally went out. Her pride, the bitter, lonely thing she had been nursing for months, suddenly seemed small and worthless in the face of a human life. "Martha!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the howl of the wind. The big woman appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face a question. "I need a horse," May said, her voice shaking but resolute. "The fastest one you have." Martha looked from May to the terrified boy and understood everything in an instant. She did not argue. She did not question. She saw the desperate resolve in May's eyes. "The bay in the end stall," she said, her voice grim. "He is strong. Take 2 blankets. And the flask of whiskey from my office? You will need it." Minutes later, May was leading the horse from the stable. She was dressed in a pair of boy's trousers and a heavy wool coat Martha had thrust at her. The wind tore at her, nearly ripping the reins from her grasp. The snow was already past her ankles, and the world had shrunk to a churning vortex of white. She swung herself into the saddle. For a moment, she sat there, the full, terrifying reality of what she was about to do crashing down on her. She was a lone woman, riding into a blizzard, chasing the ghost of a dying man who had broken her heart. It was a fool's errand, a redemption ride. Then she thought of him, alone in the dark. May. She spurred the horse, turning its head north, into the heart of the storm. The journey was a waking nightmare. The road she had traveled under a summer sun was gone, erased by the snow. She rode by instinct, by a desperate memory of the shape of the land. The wind was a physical force, a malevolent entity that sought to tear her from the saddle. The snow stung her face, freezing on her eyelashes, blinding her. The cold was a living thing, seeping through her coat, her trousers, her very bones, until she thought she would never be warm again. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the next step, and the one after that. The horse, a brave, strong animal, plodded onward, its head lowered against the punishing gale. May huddled low over its neck, sharing her meager warmth, whispering words of encouragement into its ear. Her mind, numb with cold, began to play tricks on her. In the swirling snow, she saw ghosts. She saw Jedstone's sneering face. She saw the pitying looks of the townswomen. Then she saw Reed. She saw him as he had been in the street. His face a hard mask. She is the woman who works at the bar, Jay. Nothing more. The memory was a fresh stab of pain. Why was she doing this? Then another memory surfaced, pushing the other one away. Reed, sitting by the fire, his shoulders slumped after eating her soup. Reed, his eyes clear and filled with a 16-year-old pain as he spoke of Samuel. Reed, standing still as a statue at the edge of the barn, listening to her sing. That was the man she was riding for. Not the one who had spoken out of pride and fear in the town, but the one who had spoken out of his truest heart in the fevered darkness of the cabin. She rode on, a solitary specter in the vast, roaring wilderness of white. She was no longer just the widow Harper, or the housekeeper, or the object of the town's scorn. She was a woman, riding through the heart of a storm, fueled by a love she had refused to name and a compassion that was stronger than pride, stronger than fear, stronger than the blizzard itself. She was a small, unwavering beacon of humanity, a single point of warmth and fierce intention in the midst of the overwhelming cold. And she would not be stopped. The horse was failing. May could feel the magnificent animal's strength giving out beneath her, its powerful strides shortening to a desperate, stumbling plod. The blizzard was a monster, a roaring, white-fanged beast that consumed the world. She was numb, a creature of ice and will, her body so cold she had long since lost the ability to shiver. She peered into the swirling whiteness, her eyes raw and aching, searching for a landmark, a familiar shadow, anything. There was nothing, just the endless screaming wind and the suffocating snow. She was lost, just as a wave of utter despair threatened to pull her from the saddle. She caught it, a flicker, a momentary thinning of the snow, and through it, a shape, darker than the churning gray sky, the familiar, jagged line of pine trees that bordered his clearing, and then a scent, faint but unmistakable on the wind. Wood smoke. The boy had been right. The chimney was still breathing. Hope, fierce and painful, surged through her, a fire in her frozen veins. "We are there," she gasped, her words snatched away by the wind. She leaned low over the horse's neck, urging it on, her own will pouring into the exhausted animal. Just a little farther. "We are there." The last 100 yards were a battle for every inch. The horse stumbled and went to one knee, and May nearly pitched over its head. She clung to the saddle horn, her own legs too numb to function, and somehow pulled the horse back to its feet. They broke through the tree line and into the relative shelter of the yard. The cabin was a dark, low shape, half buried in snow. A single, weak yellow light glowing in one window like a dying ember. She did not remember dismounting. One moment she was in the saddle, the next she was on the ground, her legs collapsing beneath her, pitching her face first into the deep snow. She lay there for a second, the cold a shocking, brutal embrace. But the light in the window pulled her up. She crawled the last few feet to the porch, her hands sinking into the freezing powder, and clawed her way up the steps. The door latch was frozen solid. She beat against the thick wood with her fists, the blows weak, thudding sounds that were swallowed by the storm. The door creaked open. It was the young trapper. his face pale and drawn in the lamplight. "My God," he breathed, seeing her, a specter caked in ice and snow. He pulled her inside, into the dim, cold cabin. The air inside was thick with the smells of sickness, stale wood smoke, and fear. The fire in the hearth was little more than a pile of glowing coals, giving off almost no heat. Reed was on his bunk, a twisted shape under a pile of blankets. She could hear his breathing from across the room, a harsh, rattling sound that was a struggle for every breath. "I kept the fire going as best I could," the boy said, his voice shaking. "But he is worse. He threw off the blankets an hour ago, said he was on fire." May pushed herself away from the door and stumbled toward the bunk. Reed's face was flushed a dark, angry red. His skin stretched taut over his cheekbones. His eyes were open but saw nothing, rolling in their sockets. She laid a hand on his forehead, and the heat was even more terrifying than the last time. A dry, searing heat that promised to burn the life right out of him. His leg was a swollen, misshapen lump under the blanket, and the whole cabin seemed to be filled with the metallic scent of his infection. She turned to the boy. "What is your name?" she asked, her voice a cracked whisper. "Thomas, ma'am." "Thomas, you have done well. You saved his life by coming for me. Now you must save your own. There is food in the kitchen. Take what you need. When the storm breaks, you head back to town." She had dismissed him, her focus already narrowing to the man on the bunk. She moved to the fireplace and began, with hands that felt like clumsy blocks of wood, to build up the fire. She added kindling, then larger logs, coaxing the dying embers back to life until a proper blaze roared in the hearth, pushing back the deadly chill. Then she went to the kitchen. She moved with the slow, deliberate motions of a sleepwalker, her body screaming with exhaustion, her mind a single, unwavering point of focus. She found what was left of the chickens, the onions, the carrots. She drew water from the pump. She began to chop. The familiar, rhythmic sound of the knife on the board, a steadying beat in the chaos of the storm and the sickness. She was not just making soup. She was performing a rite of reclamation. She was bringing life back to this house, one sliced carrot, one act of stubborn care at a time. As the soup began to simmer, its rich, healing aroma filling the cabin, she turned her attention to Reed. She cleaned the new wound, a horrific, jagged tear in his thigh where the log had pinned him. It was inflamed and weeping. She lanced it without hesitation, her hands steady now, her purpose absolute. She washed it with whiskey, her face impassive as he cried out in his delirium. She cleaned and rebandaged the old wound on his arm, which had indeed reopened, an old ghost rising to join the new. She bathed his face and chest with cool water, fighting the fever, whispering his name over and over, a soft, steady mantra against the howling wind. "Reed, you stay with me. Do you hear me? You stay." For 2 days, the storm raged outside, and the fever raged within. May did not sleep. She moved between the fire, the soup pot, and his bedside. She forced spoonfuls of the hot, rich broth between his lips. She bathed him. She cleaned his wounds. She held his hand when he thrashed, his mind lost in battlefields and peach orchards. And through it all, she talked to him, her voice a low, constant murmur. She told him about the garden, about the way the sun looked coming over the mountain in the morning, about the taste of the wild raspberries. She poured the life they had shared back into him, a quiet, steady transfusion of memory and hope. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm broke, the wind died down, and a strange, brilliant light filled the cabin, the reflection of a world made new and clean by snow. And inside the cabin, the fever broke, too. Reed's breathing eased, the terrible, rattling sound replaced by a deep, even rhythm. The angry flush receded from his face. He fell into a true, healing sleep. May, her work done, slumped into the chair beside his bunk, laid her head on the edge of his mattress. and was instantly lost to a black, dreamless exhaustion. She woke to a faint pressure on her hair. She lifted her head, her neck stiff, and found him awake. His eyes were clear, lucid, and fixed on her. His hand, the one that had been resting near her head, slowly drew back. He was weak, impossibly weak, but he was himself. He looked around the cabin, at the roaring fire, at the empty soup bowl on the small table beside him. He looked at the fresh bandages on his arm and leg. Then his gaze returned to her, to her face, pale and drawn with fatigue, to the smudge of soot on her cheek, to the fierce, unwavering light in her eyes. The shame and wonder in his own were so profound. They were like a physical presence in the room. "You came back," he whispered, his voice a hoarse, cracked thing. "I came back," she confirmed, her voice soft. He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping from the corner of one and tracing a path into his hair. "I would not have blamed you," he said, "for what I said. What I did, there was no excuse." She looked at this man, this strong, silent man, laid low and stripped of all his defenses. She saw the 16 years of guilt over a brother he could not save, and the fresh guilt over a woman he had almost lost. She saw his pain, his pride, his brokenness, and she saw it all with a love that was as clear and bright as the morning sun on the new snow. "No one in this world is perfect. Read," she said, her voice steady and sure. "We are all sinners, in our own way. We all carry things we wish we could set down." She reached out and laid her hand on his, her fingers cool against his warm skin. "None of us deserve to be saved, but I chose to stay." He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers, his grip surprisingly strong. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw no walls, no shadows in his eyes, only a raw, unguarded truth. "Then, Darlin," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he made no attempt to hide, "maybe redemption is not something we earn. Maybe it is something we find in each other." The last of the snows melted, and the world turned green again. Spring came to the high country with a rush of birdsong and the sweet, clean scent of damp earth. The creek, swollen with meltwater, roared a cheerful song. On the south-facing slope of the mountain, the Bar J Ranch lay bathed in a warm, gentle sunlight. A curl of smoke, white and steady, rose from the stone chimney, a signal of life, of hearth, of home. In the yard, Reed Dawson, leaning on a sturdy, hand-carved crutch, tossed a handful of grain to the chickens. He moved slowly, but his steps were growing stronger every day. A few feet away, May Harper knelt in her garden, her hands in the rich, dark soil, pressing bean seeds into the earth. Reed finished his chore and limped over to her, standing for a moment just watching her, a small, quiet smile on his face. She looked up, her own face smudged with dirt, and smiled back at him. It was an easy, open smile, filled with a light that came from deep within. No words were needed. Their silence was no longer a space between them, but the peaceful, shared ground where their lives had finally, truly, taken root. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can reach more listeners.